In today's video, I will be going through and breaking down the story of Bob Lazar. Please keep in mind that I hold my own opinions on this matter, which I will be revealing in part 2 of this series. For now, I would like you to enjoy the video as we dive straight into the Bob Lazar story. Bob has an interesting upbringing and is a bit of an unconventional fellow. As a young adult, he tinkered with engines and was known around his neighborhood block for the guy that built rocket cars. Later on in his life, he would continue to pursue this hobby, building jet bikes and even selling hydrolysis machines, a key item in converting cars to run on pure hydrogen. As fate would have it, his greatest interest would apparently lead to his greatest regrets. Fast forward to 1989, a hidden figure on national television would break one of the greatest stories and change the world of ufology forever. Area 51, also known as Dreamland, was not a topic of interest in the public's eye at that point in time. The base is located in the Lincoln area of Nevada, which positions itself around a dry lake bed called Groom Lake. The base was, and still is, a top-secret military research installation, and during its heyday in the Cold War, it helped introduce flying marvels, such as the A-12 supersonic reconnaissance jet and the U-2 spy plane. But enough of that, let's get started. A shadowy figure named Dennis took the stage on national news. He focused primarily on a secret site within Area 51 called S4, short for Site 4, where unarguably he witnessed the deepest layer of secrecy within the US government. After much reluctancy, and with the assistance of George Knapp, whom at the time was a reporter for Channel 8 News, convinced Bob to identify himself and go all out with the story. The world finally saw Dennis's true identity, and news stations all over the world covered Bob's story. But how did Bob find himself at S4 working on secret extraterrestrial technology? It started when he was working at Los Alamos National Lab, where he worked there as a physicist in the Meson Physics facility. Sounds like something out of Half-Life, doesn't it? Many came to question not only where he worked, but also the education he claimed to receive. Some people, including the head honchos at Los Alamos, denied that Bob had even worked there to begin with. But I'll leave that all for part 2 of the series, where I'll be speaking more deeply about Bob's critics. So for the record, everything I mention here is alleged, as it all came from Bob himself. A call was made to Bob. He was told that he would be hired to replace 2 scientists that were killed while working on a reactor, after the reactor had exploded. His interview was with EG&G, who contracts out for the military. He'd be working there as a senior staff physicist for Project Galileo, although he questioned his title later on when he began working there, because he wasn't supervising anyone. Lazar would have something called Majestic Clearance, which is supposedly 38 levels above the civilian top-secret clearance, also known as Q clearance. Majestic Clearance is still a topic of debate today, regards to whether or not it's an actual clearance level that existed. To get to S4, Bob had to be flown out and taken to Area 51 directly, and then a bus would pick him up from the base along with some others, and taken to another area called Papoose Lake, just southwest of Groom Lake. What happened next is key in analyzing just what kind of person Bob is. On his 3rd visit to Papoose Lake, rather than the bus pulling up into the main entrance, it instead made its way around a mountain. On the other side, a set of camouflage hangars were embedded into the mountain itself. When Bob stepped out, he noticed one hangar door open, and inside of it lay a saucer-shaped craft. His initial thought was, oh, this explains all the UFO sightings, thinking that it was just an advanced fighter the military had been working on. He would be disillusioned by this fact until much later, when he finally understood its true capabilities. Bob briefly pointed out that they used a classified method to scan people into the building. It was some sort of form of bone density scanner, where one would place their hands on metal rivets and it would capture a unique print. Oddly enough, these scanners have only just been declassified by the US military. In the Bob Lazar film, Jeremy Corbell displayed to Bob images of the scanner, and Bob's reaction was quite surprised. He never thought he would have seen that scanner again in his life upon his departure of S4. During Bob's many briefings at S4, he learned that the craft he would work on originated from a planet that orbited the Zeta Reticuli star system, more specifically, Zeta 2 Reticuli. This is no coincidence. In 1961, known famously as the Betty and Barney Hill incident, an American couple claimed that they were abducted by aliens. Their claims were obviously extraordinary, but apparently the wife, Betty, was able to map out the entire star system that her abductors claimed they originated from. This star system was indeed Zeta Reticuli. In the briefing files, he'd also mentioned that he saw a deceased alien body which was being dissected. It apparently had an organ that worked as a central organ which took care of all the essential functions of the body. Another image in the briefing file displayed what is now considered as the gray alien. Bob estimated it to be around 3 to 4 feet tall, but he had nothing to compare it to. So again, this observation was based on Bob's estimates. He later found out that he would assist in back engineering one of the flying saucers he saw. The disc he attempted to back engineer was the sleekest model out of the 9 craft he saw at S4. He nicknamed it the sports model. This craft had 3 levels. The lower level housed the gravity amplifiers. The middle level was the bridge area. This is where one would pilot the craft, and the top level was not known to Bob. The hatch of the ship, when a honeycomb-shaped design located on it was pressed in, would collapse into a series of other honeycomb structures to allow for an opening. When Bob first stepped into the craft, he described the feeling as ominous, like he shouldn't be there. At this point, the real work began. He started to understand just how the craft functioned, what powered it, how it flew. He explains that the craft produces and phase shifts a gravity wave. Basically, it generates its own gravitational field, so the craft is influenced only by this field. There are 3 amplifiers in total. The craft is able to lift off using only one of these amplifiers. This is what is called an Omicron configuration. A Delta configuration is when the craft utilizes all 3 gravity amplifiers. This configuration is used for space travel. The craft would tilt up on its side, focus the amplifiers to a single point, and move through space in this manner. The craft's propulsion, if I can even call it that, works counterintuitively with what we know through conventional aerospace mechanics. Once the craft is floating in Omicron configuration, it rotates the 2 remaining amplifiers in the direction it wants to travel. It then creates a gravity distortion, whereby the craft falls into the distortion. One interesting note is that these crafts are void of inertia. What this means is that a craft can make as many turns at any angles it pleases, while accelerating at any velocity, and the passengers inside wouldn't be under the effects of G-loading. Simplified, they wouldn't be banging up against the walls. What was also interesting is when the craft enters maximum distortion, whereby all 3 gravity amplifiers are turned on, the metal as witnessed from the bridge area becomes transparent. The archway displays a form of unfamiliar, otherworldly writing. This writing is presumed to be the flight control and navigational interface. He was fortunate enough to also witness one of these crafts fly. It was a low performance test that occurred at sundown over Papoose Lake. Before the craft took off, there was a coronal discharge at the bottom, then it began hovering above ground, not making a single sound. The craft then moved left and right, then landed. The test was simple, but nevertheless fantastic in Bob's eyes. It was like seeing a giant house lift off the ground with relative ease, and in the process, no sound would emanate from it. If you were to stand underneath the craft while it was operational and look up at it, you would actually see what is above the craft. This is because of how the gravitational field affects light around the craft. This concept is well known in science. Through gravitational lensing, one could view objects behind the sun, for an example, due to the sun's powerful gravitational field. Gravity bends space, space and time are interconnected. One final interesting note regarding the synthetic gravitational field. Bob's coworker at S4 demonstrated that once the field was turned on, it was seemingly impervious to any physical object. Bob tested this in several ways. Firstly, Bob attempted to place his hands on the half-dome shielding the 115. No matter how hard he tried, there was a force that repelled his hands away, as if his body was a magnet of opposite polarity to the dome housing. There was clearly a force field surrounding this object. Secondly, Bob attempted to throw a golf ball at the gravity amplifier to study the effects. Unsurprisingly, the golf ball was deflected away from the amplifier due to the force field surrounding it. There was another interesting phenomenon. Bob was told to place a candle underneath the gravity generators. Once the generator was turned on, the burning flame stood perfectly still, as if it was trapped in time. Bob commented on the craft's appearance. It had a dull gray metallic-like finish. It had no seams, no corners. Everything was rounded, as if it was injection molded. There was another set of projects occurring at S4 during Bob's time. Keep in mind that Bob was only involved with Project Galileo, and none of the others. Project Psychic dealt with any weapon potential of the craft, whether or not the craft could be weaponized. He inferred that you could technically create a particle beam by using the gravity generator as a lens to focus a weapon of some sort. Project Looking Glass dealt with time distortions that were measured in milliseconds, obviously by using the craft's technology to aid him in this research. What you're about to hear next is what drew the most criticism towards Bob Lazar. This will be explained in more detail in part 2 of the video, but I'll go over the topic to provide the appropriate context. The most controversial matter so far is what actually powers the craft. The science here starts to get really murky when viewing it through the lens of current modern science. Because none of this can be validated, many have gone to just dismiss it as hogwash. Nevertheless, Bob is adamant in describing what he saw as the truth. The material that powers the craft is strictly an extraterrestrial substance. Through conjecture, Bob claims that this material could be found in other star systems, but he deems it to not exist naturally anywhere on Earth. This material is aptly named Element 115, which refers to its position in the periodic table. At the time that Bob was describing this element, the periodic table had only reached Element 112, so Element 115 was not too far off on the horizon. We need to take a slight tangent here and briefly explain just how these elements are found. When these elements are synthesized, scientists are only creating 1 or 2 atoms at a time. The issue here is that Bob claims, through a friend of his that worked at Los Alamos, that they harbored 500 pounds of this material, a staggering amount. Since 115 is highly classified, it was codenamed LA-1000 at Los Alamos National Lab. How could they harbor so much Element 115 if the element was never created on Earth? This is currently unknown. Let's take a look at how Element 115 actually powers the craft. The element, which is molded and cut into a thin triangular piece, is placed at the top of the reactor, which lies at the center of the mid-level area of the craft. The base of the reactor apparently works like a particle accelerator. A particle is accelerated from the base up a tube and is aimed at the 115 sitting in an enclosure above. The particle, upon interacting with 115, causes a reaction and transmutes the 115 into 116. The reaction produces antimatter, something we've yet to ever see. The antimatter is guided down a tuned tube and reacts with a gas. Since this reaction is between matter and antimatter, a large amount of energy is converted. This energy is converted to electric power through a thermoelectric converter. Keep in mind, there is no evidence of wiring in this craft, which makes it all the more puzzling. He mentions something else quite disturbing. The thermionic generator in the craft is 100% efficient, which violates the first law of thermodynamics. The conversion of heat into electricity occurs with no wasted energy. Aside from the mechanics, Bob had allegedly commented at one point that he had taken a piece of this Element 115 home, but refuses to comment on this fact. Most likely because anytime he makes mention of owning 115, the feds come knocking at his door. The entire story up to now has described Bob at the peak of his career at S4. Little would he know that what he did next would cost him his job, as well as his personal safety. His entire life would change after the following incident. Lazar decided that he would bring his friends near the test site, where they would routinely fly the craft on Wednesday evenings. The choice of day and time was supposedly due to the traffic being the calmest around that area. This reduced the risk of any vital secrets being leaked into the public. In routine visits, Bob brought over his wife at the time, his friends John Lear and Gene Huff, over to a pitch-black area in the Nevada desert at around 2 a.m., near the test site. They would routinely visit the area for the next 3 weeks every Wednesday. Bob knew the schedule of the test flights because of what was told to him at S4. It had almost been like a prophecy. At around the time they showed up, lo and behold, they witnessed the craft lift off in the distance above the mountain range and perform seemingly impossible maneuvers. They even managed to record some of the footage. Bob's luck ran out very quickly. On their third visit to the desert, they were caught by security personnel. The next day, Bob was taken to be interrogated by his superiors at an Air Force base. It was safe to assume they weren't pleased with what Bob did. They threatened him, going as far as using every fear tactic in the book, short of physically harming him. And with that, I will end part 1 of the series. I will be discussing the aftermath of the events, as well as providing a detailed set of points and counterpoints to Bob's claims. Within part 2, I will also weigh in on Bob's critics and how the lore has evolved through the last several decades. Thank you for listening. I'll see you all again soon for part 2, Bob Lazar, The Aftermath.